Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, April 11th, 2023. The time is 7 p.m. Roll call, Joe Murphy.
Here.
Paul Jordan is absent. Susan Axelrod. Here. Liz Karp is absent. Peter DiStefano. Here. Robin Pothier.
Here.
And Maria Mack is here. With the board's agreement, staff has requested that we reverse items C and B so that we can begin this evening with our continuing education for planning board members, kindly being given by legal counsel Andy Tights. Is everyone all right with that? Great.
Is Andy okay with that?
Interesting first visual.
Let me explain where we are. The chair asked me to provide some training here, and this is something actually we'd been planning on doing. As I think you know, the General Assembly, after many years of lobbying from people like me and Maria, finally passed legislation to require training. This is for planning board members, zoning board members, and historic district commission members. And the way it is, within the first 2 years, from either when someone is appointed to a board or the adoption of the bill, which was this past summer, you're required, there's a 3-hour introductory session. And then after that, you're required to have an hour of extra training, or is it 2 hours every year? And then there's also the specific stuff with planning board for climate change and resiliency. I have been involved in doing this training for 30-some years, first way back with URI when they were the ones doing it, and then Division of Statewide Planning and GrowSmart, and later too, now again with the statewide planning, and I was involved in preparing these materials. So that allows me to be certified as a teacher. So if I tell you this, as opposed to most other solicitors, you actually can get the credit for this. So the way they do it is, they do it as a 3-hour thing, and it can be Zoom or it can be in person, but they've got a 3-hour course. Excuse me, I am breaking it up. I'm targeting just for an hour tonight. And then I figure over the next few months, we'll pick up the other 2 hours, but at the end of that time, you'll be able to have that as your certificate. Now, some of you may have it already, either have done the Zoom course or other training, but for those of you who haven't, this will provide that training as part of it. So my goal is to, I've broken it up into hour-and-a-half sections before. My goal is just to go for an hour tonight. I have a fair amount of material because I worry about running out of material. If we don't get to the end of it, it doesn't matter. So I just need a way to advance it, or you wanna, can I just?
Can I just ask then, does this only count towards the introductory 3 hours or the mandatory 2 hours a year afterward?
No, well, this counts just for the introductory one. Everyone has to have that 3-hour introductory one first.
Right? Most of us have that?
Who of you have done the 3-hour already?
Is this what we did with Nancy Hess?
Yes.
Then I have.
Yeah.
Okay. So 2 of you have.
Yeah, we attended the same session, actually.
So,
Okay. On Zoom or in person, or?
Zoom, yeah.
So, well, some of it may be repetitive, and some of you may know anyway, but hopefully, the advantage of having me here is, and the reason I like to do it in person too, is because of the ability to deal with questions and issues And you won't have Nancy Hess telling you, go talk to your solicitor and ask your solicitor about it. You know, we can talk about actual, you know, real cases in front of you. So, and I will try to, you know, skim over the basics. I've already cut a lot of it out. I'm going to go right. This is what they had for the topics that they have for their 3 hours. And as you can see from the highlights, that's the most we're going to talk about tonight. Just the history, leaving out all that about us, about statewide planning, roles and responsibilities, ethics and public interest, and the land use reviews. As I said, in order to get the credit, for those of you who haven't had the credit, I need to use their materials. But I don't have to, I'm not going to go over them verbatim or just read from anything like that. So although they'll be our guidelines, we won't be limited strictly to it. And please do interrupt at any time if you have any questions or anything like that. Interrupt, and if I don't notice you cough or just shout out whatever, don't hesitate. We got a small enough, intimate enough group, it doesn't matter. So I'll just go back to they had the goals of the training, provide knowledge, ensure you understand legal obligations, talk about best practices, and hopefully avoid costs from appeals and legal actions. Then they've got this little goals here. This information is not legal advice. Well, it is. This is where you're lucky. You do get the legal advice. So you're getting the benefit. So talking about actually, I don't think I'm going to need this at all. This is close enough for me to see. So what is land use planning? This is just a general process of protecting and improving a community through oversight of use and development of land for enjoyment of everyone through equitable decisions. And we're going to come back. That equitable decisions part will echo throughout this in a couple of areas of due process and even the land use decision process. We'll be dealing with it. It ensures that resources are used sufficiently so that the needs of the people are met while safeguarding future resources. And it involves the allocation of land to different uses across a landscape. Planning provides a vision for the community today and in the future. Why? To guide decisions on land use, etc. What's land use? Basically in a sense of how we use the land. In this country, we mainly have what we think of as Euclidean zoning. Now that's not anything mathematical as in Euclid. That is in the city of Euclid, which was the first real case to reach the Supreme Court where zoning was challenged. And in the city of Euclid in the 1920s, the U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, it's okay to exercise the police power in this fashion. You can divide up your different areas into different zones and keep your uses separate, and that was thought to be a good thing. You keep your, particularly if you think about it, at the time the industrial uses were much more noxious. No one was regulating what was coming out of the water or the air from those factories, and you can keep your houses separate from them. And there was also a bit of racial and class prejudice too. This idea of having these sacred little single-family neighborhoods that would be away from any kind of disturbance or trouble. History of planning has been around since ancient times, ancient Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans. Ted Sanderson's famous example was the Roman emperor who had a decree that if anyone knocked down a building without his approval, they would have their hand cut off. Ted thought we needed something like that to enforce historic preservation. In this country, started around 1900, pushed by the industrial age. First regulations were, ironically enough, in Los Angeles, which we don't think of as a good planning example. Advanced with modernism of the 20s. Interestingly enough, Hartford, Connecticut was the first city with a permanent planning commission. Zoning originated in other parts in Prussia, Britain, and Scandinavia. Westerly was the first community in Rhode Island to have a zoning enabling act all the way back in 1905. And as I mentioned, the U.S. Supreme Court validated it in 1926 with the Euclid case. In Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Supreme Court validated the Providence zoning ordinance in 1923. This was all about that time. There was also, although not mentioned here, one of the big reasons for the growth of zoning and planning, and you may have wondered if you're, maybe it's just me, but you happen to you travel around the country and you look at different zoning ordinances, or you're reading things, and there's a lot of language in zoning ordinances that seems to be the same around the country. And that's because of Herbert Hoover. Because before he was president, he was secretary of what was then the Interior Department, which included housing. And as part of their charge, they actually prepared model planning guidelines and model zoning ordinances that they made available for everyone to use these model ordinances. So that's one of the big reasons for the growth of it starting in the 20s. Both the Roaring 20s, there was a lot of development going on, so there was a lot of pressure to regulate it. And the federal government came out, here's this model ordinance that you can adopt. Now, the benefits weren't all good because these same efforts at zoning were taken up by the other side, financing for housing, and that's where we get the origin of redlining neighborhoods. Depending what they were zoned, oftentimes it depended on, that would be what they would be redlined, and mortgages wouldn't be available in particular zoning districts. And that's how that started as well. Roles and responsibilities. You have legal powers and responsibility. You're appointed to protect the public interest. The public interest affects the general welfare of the community as a whole, is important to justify government regulation, and it's protected by enacting comprehensive plans, zoning ordinances, and other regulations, and enforcing them consistently over time. That's really the key here, that there's consistent enforcement of it. And where does this power come from? It comes initially from the federal government, in the U.S. Constitution. Before that, it came through the British Crown, but the federal government. The Constitution laws delegates or leaves to the states certain power. The states have their police powers. So the state of Rhode Island has enacted enabling legislation. The big three are the Comprehensive Planning Act, the Zoning Enabling Act, and the Land Development and Subdivision Review Act. These all spring from a period of time between 1988 and 1992. And before that, there were enabling acts that were in existence. Well, first, starting, as I said, 1905, you've got town of Westerly, and then you had individual towns, one after another, Newport, Bristol, Providence. They had individual enabling acts. Finally, the state enacted general enabling acts for these things, and particularly after World War II, enacted a subdivision enabling act, allowed the cities and towns to regulate that. But they were very different, even starting with the comprehensive planning. Before 1988, there was and had been in the law for a long time a requirement that every community have a comprehensive plan. However, if you went and looked for that comprehensive plan, you would find a wide range of results. Some places did have a real, what we would consider a comprehensive plan, fairly large book or report talking about where they were expecting growth and how they were expecting to do it, and so forth. Other communities had an economic development brochure, and they called that their comprehensive plan. Some communities didn't have it at all. And that made it kind of hard when the local council would amend the zoning ordinance. Because even then, the laws provided that the zoning should be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And you shouldn't, if someone would challenge a zoning amendment as spot zoning, and the court would say, well, is this consistent with the comp plan? But there isn't a comp plan, how do we know? So the courts ended up saying, well, you look at the zoning, and the land use map, and whatever your land use map is in your zoning ordinance is your comprehensive plan. So then it became really confusing as to whether you could, was an amendment consistent or not? Was it not consistent because it wasn't the same as what had been? Or since the council had changed it and now that was the map, it was automatically consistent? It really was a toothless regulation in many sense. Same thing with zoning enabling. Zoning, if you read the statute all the way up to 1991, from 1961 to 1991, for 30 years, if you just opened the book, and at that point it was a book, and read the chapter on zoning, you would see that there was just one kind of variance, and if you ever applied to a zoning board for a variance, you had to prove hardship that amounted to loss of all beneficial use of the property. Basically, your property was going to be confiscated if you didn't get this variance, and that was the standard. But in fact, the Rhode Island Supreme Court in 1961 came up with a case called Vitti versus the Zoning Board of Review of Providence, they decided, and that was a case where developers were looking for relief from the number of parking spaces required for one of the early Providence skyscrapers, or not early, but one of the Providence skyscrapers. And in that case, the Supreme Court came up with this doctrine that said basically, well, that statute is really talking about true use variances, where you just want to do a use that's not allowed. When it's not a true use variance, if it's something like parking, or maybe it's a yard setback or a lot coverage requirement, that's not a true variance. So you don't have to prove that loss of all beneficial use. You just have to prove something else, which was that you would suffer a hardship amounting to more than a mere inconvenience if you didn't get it. So, and by the way, more than a mere inconvenience was not defined. It's kind of like pornography. We know it when we see it. And in the statutes from 1991 on, there have been various attempts to define it, which have backfired. So it's still very vague. But the point is, it wasn't there in the statutes at all. It was just a court-created doctrine. If you weren't a lawyer and you didn't read the law books that had commentaries on the cases, you would never know it existed. And then finally, the old Subdivision Review Act defined subdivisions by what they were not. Basically, there was a four-part test. If you have frontage on a road, if you meet the zoning requirements, a couple other things, there's a four-part test. If you met that four-part test, then you weren't a subdivision, and you didn't need to get subdivision approval. But even then, it was totally inconsistent in how it was applied. Some cities or towns, you could just come in and say, yeah, my plat meets that test and record it. And the clerk would say, okay. In other places, you'd go to the planner, and they'd look at it and say, okay, meets the four-part test. Here's the stamp, subdivision approval not required. In still other communities, you might go through months of meetings before the planning board, where the planning board would examine your plans in minute detail, and then at the end of the time determine, okay, you're right, subdivision approval isn't required, after they had already spent months approving it anyway. So that was kind of the municipal landscape in the late 1980s. And at that point, a commission was created. And it was kind of a typical Rhode Island commission. It had 23 members, and all different bodies got the right to appoint people. The governor appointed a couple of members. The lieutenant governor appointed a few members. The Speaker of the House appointed some members. The minority leader in the House appointed members. Wasn't the Senate president then, but the majority leader of the Senate and the minority leader of the Senate each got a couple of appointees. And plus there was a requirement that among all the appointees, there were members of the public. There had to be members from small towns, medium-sized towns, large towns, planners. There was this whole requirement, the Builders Association. Everybody got a representative on this committee, which kind of left two impacts. One was the fact that, like any committee, some things in the legislation were deliberately vague because that's the only thing that everybody could agree on, was if it were vague. On the other hand, what was agreed on was agreed on. It left with legislation that was able to pass and move forward, and everybody agreed on what they did. So the three acts there, the Comprehensive Planning Act, 1988, basically said every city and town had to have a real comprehensive plan with several elements and define the elements, and that's what you know as your comprehensive plan then, now, and in fact, additional elements have been added to it. And it has the requirement, you've got to have the plan so you can have your other laws consistent with it. It requires that the state of Rhode Island approve your comprehensive plan, but that comes with the benefit that then it covers state agencies. If you have an approved comprehensive plan, state agencies can't do things that are not consistent with your comprehensive plan. For example, we've had scenic roadways as a good example. If you've got a scenic roadway and you've got that laid out in your comprehensive plan and duly adopted, that keeps DOT from coming in and widening and straightening your scenic roadway, because they're bound by it as well, even if it's a state highway. Then you've got your Zoning Enabling Act, which was passed in 1991. It actually, if you think about it, 2 years, it should have been 1990, but it didn't pass for a wholly unrelated feud between the Senate and the House that year, so it actually didn't pass till 91. And the Zoning Enabling Act basically just codified a lot of what the old case law was. It took the VD variance language and gave it a new name of calling it a dimensional variance, but kept the standards and so forth. Same things like abandonment. It codified a lot of what the case law had been, but was not substantially changed. So in a way, the Zoning Enabling Act is the oldest of the acts as far as a lot of the elements in it. And then the Land Development and Subdivision Review Act in 1992 basically changed. One of the things it did was give planning boards a lot more power. Planning boards were really put in the position of really doing planning, reviewing a lot of things, making clear development plan review would be done by planning boards or technical review committees of planning boards. And over the years, that's even gotten greater with unified development given to planning boards. And in the beginning of the Low and Moderate Income Housing Act, that was split. It was up to the town. It could be zoning board or planning board, but that changed, so that's just the planning board. So planning boards became more of the principal land use permitting and planning agency than they had prior to that time. Before I go on, any questions?
This is something that you might touch upon later, but initially you had said a couple of the goals for land use planning, protecting and improving the community. I'd like to know at some point how we as a board can use the regulatory authority that we have to feel as though we are doing that. And then the other thing is safeguarding future resources. I think many of us often feel that we're not able to do that, not only in terms of the current and future impacts of climate change, but we don't have that type of either authority in our regulations, or they're not specific enough, or what have you. So just something to...
Okay, sure.
Can I add a question too? Does the planning board have the ability to appeal an appeal that the state has made a decision on? So, so let's say that somebody appealed our decision to the state, and the state makes a decision, and the planning board maybe doesn't agree with it. Can we appeal that?
No. The town can only act in court through basically its town solicitor, town or city solicitor, and which is at the direction of, depending where you are. I guess if you're in a city, it's at the direction of the mayor, but with the town, it'd be the town council. So they alone can make that decision as to whether to appeal something or not. It's also if it was an internal thing, if, for example, if there was a planning board decision that was appealed to the zoning board by an applicant, and the zoning board overturned the planning board. The planning board can't say, we want to keep fighting, we want to go on to Superior Court. You can't do it. You're all considered part of the administrative body of the town, unless the town council, there is something called the public interest exception. If the town council will determine that there was some public reason for doing it, the town council could direct that the town would take a further appeal of its own zoning board decision. It is rare, but again, it has to come through the council.
And it wouldn't be against a state decision?
No, I mean, it would be a local, I mean, if you were, I mean, the town council might well on its own decide, if you're talking, for example, about affordable housing, something with the State Housing Appeals Board, yes, to appeal that to the Superior Court. And if you lose there or win there, to go further to the Supreme Court. But that's not a decision of the planning board to make. It has to be a decision of the town council. Yep.
Joe, you stole my question.
Just,
That's my question,
I
too.
should have had this, I'm sorry about that, so I will do it.
Joe, just for clarity, you're speaking specific to a potential a comprehensive permit scenario?
Not necessarily. I use that as an example, but what I was really looking at is when somebody's asking for a variance.
So I'll just try and separate, because most of the things that the planning board's seeing is a waiver of an existing regulation. Variances are handled by the zoning board.
Okay.
So in most instances, you have a set criteria or standards within your subdivision design regulations or the dimensional regulations, and within your own zoning code, it allows a developer to seek relief in the form of a waiver. And I think, Andy, what Joe's question is how much discretion do they have when those waivers are asked for? Mm-hmm. And the waivers, there's language in our regulations that state a waiver can be granted for kind of
Hardship.
exceptional aspects associated with hardships of the development. You can grant a waiver for what is deemed to be good planning. That terminology's in there. And again, I think it's two separate issues in a standard application, and then it's potential different set of criteria and authority if it's a comprehensive permit. So if you can kind of talk about those.
And
two types of
often it's
application.
more than one waiver. It can be multiple waivers with multiple consequences.
And every developer will explain to the planning board that it makes great planning sense to approve the waiver.
So, this is going, how do I get that back? I'll let you, it's still up there, I don't know. I'll let you play with that while I answer. So there's a lot of different things. I'm going to actually kind of fall back on the comprehensive plan, since that's what we're talking about. And in the comprehensive plan, by its very nature, there are contradictory aspects of it. There's parts of the economic development that talk about, we want to do this, and we want to have more things and build more stuff. And then we've got our natural resources, and we want to conserve stuff. And then we have housing, we want to create housing. So there is automatically some conflict, if you will, even inherent internal inconsistencies within the comprehensive plan. So as far as that goes, That's actually what your job is, to weigh those aspects of it. And it kind of, you have a couple of different ways, and I guess we'll go from the simple to the complex. So the simple one is, if you're doing things like subdivisions, or, I swear I didn't break it. No. I didn't touch it, it just went dark. You just reboot the whole thing?
Let's see if I'm just going to leave the room for a moment.
You're fine on your own.
Try and disconnect.
Anyway, so let's say you've got a simple subdivision, and it's what we might call a by right subdivision. And so you're basically looking, your aspect, you're mainly looking for, does it meet the requirements of what they have by right? Does it meet all your requirements that you have? I was going to skip forward to the page, but there's your 7 particular findings that you need to make. No significant negative environmental impact, does it have frontage on a road, does it actually have access to a road, all those things, you need to look at those things. And that's where your discretion comes in, and if you're balancing it, you're basically balancing it against the owner's property rights to develop that property. They bought it, they had reasonable investment-backed expectations, or maybe they weren't reasonable, but they had investment-backed expectations. And you need to be looking at that. We talk about reasonable investment-backed expectations. That's the language from the United States Supreme Court case, the Penn Central case, which talks about a taking and if, what's a taking or not. And that's a whole nother thing that I'm not going to get into tonight per se, but that's part of it. One of my examples is, if someone buys a lot and they only pay $500 for the lot, and then they're coming in and asking for a whole variety of waivers, whatever, things like that, that they're asking for, or variances to develop it, and they say, you're taking my property if you don't allow me to do it. Well, the answer may be yes. And what are your damages? $500? I mean, what were your inspections? You really thought you had a lot that you could come to the planning board, and after the planning board, it would be worth $150,000, and you only paid $500 for it? Is that a reasonable investment-backed expectation? So that's one of the things that you're balancing there. Then you start getting more complicated when people do start asking for various waivers and relief and things like that. And that's when you're balancing. Will this waiver, is it better planning practice? Is it not better planning practice? Is it better planning practice, but is it going to have a harmful effect on the neighborhood? Is it going to have a harmful effect on future development? For example, someone who's only going to just cut off frontage lots and totally landlock something in back. Those are the sort of things you're looking at and weighing. And then you get to larger developments, you get to comprehensive permits. And there, you're really explicitly, you're balancing the need for affordable housing in your community and your progress toward achieving your goals for affordable housing on the one hand, with possible harm to the present and future residents of the community, including the residents of that particular comprehensive permit location. That's what you're called on to balance. It's a little bit harder with a comprehensive permit because the standards are asynchronous. For example, when you've got your regular old subdivision or land development project, you've got your 7, is this the PowerPoint? So can I get to, how do I get, no, can I get to the side thing? So I was going to skip around. Actually, wait, if we take this one, we should do it, right? Okay. Yes. Okay. So now we got it. Yeah. Okay. So here's your standards for planning boards. Right? I've got planning boards. comprehensive plan consistency, zoning ordinance consistency, no significant environmental impacts, no lots with physical constraints that would make building impractical, all lots have permanent access to public street from all lots, all requirements are met for physical design, public design, so forth. So if you have an applicant and they don't meet all of those standards, then you can deny it. In order to be granted their approval, they need to meet all of the standards. And if you don't meet the standards, it's denied. So it's synchronous. It's the same standards for approval or denial. When you get to comprehensive permits, you have one set of standards for approval and another set of standards for denial, and they're not the same. There's similarity and overlap, but it's not, you can't say, all right, there are these 7 steps standards for approval, you don't meet all 7 standards, therefore we're denying you. You have to instead go to the denial standards and deal with that. And so first of all, you've got to have a certified comprehensive plan. And there's legislation pending and whatnot. If your comprehensive plan has expired and is not duly enacted, it may be totally useless. But assuming your comprehensive plan has been approved on renewal and you have it, then you have the ability, and this is what we're saying, the proposal is not consistent with local needs, including but not limiting to the needs identified in the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance. And that's a pretty vague, meaningless standard, because it doesn't just mean, well, local needs means enforcing the zoning. You want all these differences from the zoning, like you want 50 units where only 25 would normally be allowed. That's not something you can put that way.
Sorry, can I ask before you move on? So if we fall short on one of these, that's enough, right? Like,
What do you mean if
second
we
one,
fall short?
our community has not met the 10%.
Right,
So to me, that looks like,
right. You can't use that.
we can't deny.
You can't
Because
deny.
one of these is in play, which is we haven't met our 10%. So if a
No.
comp,
No, you just
plan
can't
comes in
use
front of
that.
us-
You would be able to deny it without having to deal with the other two if you had that, if you had
Yes.
that, the 10%.
But since we don't have 10%,
Right.
It doesn't make the other bullet points moot. Is that what you're asking?
well,
You only have
Right.
two instead of 3.
okay, so if we have not met our 10%,
Right.
but the project, I'm really concerned about the welfare of the environment.
Right.
Can I deny it if I can't satisfy that 10% one? Or is that going to fail because we don't have our 10%? We therefore, I feel like our hands are tied for these comp permits because we don't have our 10%, and that's the deal breaker.
So the answer is my usual, yes and no. Your hands, what I would probably say, my analogy is you have one hand tied behind your back. You're not totally tied with your hands tied, but you don't have a lot of discretion. As I said, basically, so you're looking at, really, that's the major one you're looking at, is the third one down there at the bottom. Concerns for the environment and health and safety of current residents have not been adequately addressed. The first one with local needs is hard. I would say, I'd give you an example for local needs, is let's say someone is coming in with a proposal that's going to be, and this is the irony, because it's probably the opposite of what you want. Someone comes in with a proposal for all elderly affordable housing. But if your local needs show that you've already got enough housing for affordable, what you need is family affordable housing, because that's supposed to be part of your housing element of your comprehensive plan as well, breaking down the percentages and the numbers of what kind of units you need. We need so many elderly affordable, we need so many family affordable, we need so many SRO-type affordable, mental health issues, things like that. So if you're not meeting the local needs of, even for the affordable, that's one way to say no. Other than that, you're mainly there just the concerns for the environment and the health and safety, and that's what you have to balance. And you can't just say, well, we want to protect the environment, so we're not going to allow the housing here. So most of these are some sort of compromise. Well, you know, there's some protection of the environment and there's some increase in density of the housing. There's some compromise between those two elements.
Andy, and the next potential question that Susan would have, or other board members would have, is, under the concerns for the environment and the health and safety of the current residents, determining the term adequately addressed. In most instances, you will have 2, 3, 4, 5 expert witnesses explaining to the planning board how they have mitigated any concerns associated with the environment, have clearly identified that there are no safety issues associated with current residents within the community. And I've always been taught, if an expert testimony tells you something, unless you refute that or have alternative professional testimony, you have to accept that, unless you can bring to the table, we'll say, a contrary professional opinion. So I think the difficulty is there may be and the key, the word there, concern. There's always concern, but how do you, I know in my understanding of case law, if you ever are challenged, that a concern is not an actual impact. And I think there's a fine line between every planning board member is concerned about those very specific things, but quantifying an actual impact versus a concern. Can you just try and touch upon that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you're right. The law in Rhode Island is that the decisions have to be supported by competent evidence. And competent evidence is generally expert evidence. You know, if 20 people get up, 50 people get up from the neighborhood and say, this is terrible, there's going to be way too much traffic going through our neighborhood from this comprehensive permit, and our children are going to be endangered playing in the streets and whatever. That's, and my basement's going to flood. Right. That's not competent evidence. If a traffic engineer says it, it is. Or what I think you're looking for is advice. You need, from your point of view, you do have competent evidence in your professional planning staff to refute planning issues and consistency with the comp plan and so forth. They can be deemed your experts to refute the planner that's on the other side. If there is a traffic expert on the other side, I mean, one of the things that we often do with stuff is peer review, that the town would, you know, hire at the applicant's expense its own expert to review their materials and critique it and determine whether they're valid or not. And probably the most common and important would be traffic engineering and the drainage issues. And there is a case, Steve O.V. Lynch, it was about East Providence. It was an East Providence case, and it was a case where development, it wasn't affordable housing, but was overturned. There was a lot of testimony about drainage issues and whatnot, and the court said there's a difference between, you got to have a licensed engineer who's going to tell you what the calculations are, so many feet per second and the runoff and so forth. You don't have to be a licensed engineer to see standing water in the street or standing water here after storms. And if there's, you know, information presented that way, in that case anyway, the court allowed that. That was part of the justification for the denial by the planning board, and the planning board did, in fact, it was upheld on that case. So it doesn't have to be experts on everything, but it certainly helps, and it needs to quantify it. It can't just be speculative. And as I said too, part of it is a balancing test. You're weighing the benefit to the community of having the additional housing with the detriments to the community, which might be more traffic for a particular area. The question is that traffic going to be such that it's going to be a safety hazard, or is it just going to be an inconvenience? Those are the sort of the questions. The same thing with the environment. Is this going to be something that's going to jeopardize a groundwater recharge area that, provides services wells and thousands of people of water supply are at risk? Or is this going to be, a minor incursion into a wetland? It may endanger the particular health of that wetland. Those are the sort of things that you're balancing as you're looking at it all.
And-
Obviously, when it goes on appeal to SHAB is set up to be balanced the other way in favor of affordable housing. So that's the problem that's hard. Now, you don't lose every case before SHAB. There are a lot of cases, a lot of denials that have been upheld by SHAB over the years. So it's not quite as one-sided as one thinks. But it's hard. It's hard also because of their procedural rules. Again, this is all assuming that things don't change drastically, but various legislation. But I'll just give you one example. In this question of how are you working, how are you doing in your goals to 10%? How far are you to your goal of 10%? SHAB looks at your number when you denied the particular case that's before it. So you might get to SHAB 2 years later. You denied it, it got appealed, you have briefings. It's 2 years later, you're arguing with SHAB, and your community has, approved 200 units. You're now at 7% instead of 4% from where you were, but it doesn't matter. SHAB says it's the number when you denied it, and you were only at 4%, therefore you're not making progress to it. So they have, those are various things that stack the deck against you.
I have another question. So hypothetically, there's a horrible project ahead of us. It's got some affordable housing, but I deem it not good for the community. What is my risk for denying it if SHAB overturns me? Does that change? How does that change this project that we denied? Does it make it worse? Does it? I feel, and I only speak for myself, that I sort of feel like I'm being held hostage by my fear of SHAB. And if I deny it, I may lose any grounds I had. But I guess I don't understand. If SHAB overturns, what do I get back? And
Okay.
what's my power then?
Well, so before I can answer that, I have to ask you, why do you think it would be bad for the community? You need to be able to articulate that and have that documented before you can have any chance of success. That's the question. Why is this bad for the community?
I can't articulate that because I'm not speaking about a specific project.
Okay.
I think what council's saying is, in that, and that's why I brought this up specifically, concern for the environment, health, and safety of the current residents have not been adequately addressed. And I'll just expand on something that Andy had said. You got a lot of projects that have come through you in the past 3 years while I've been here and prior to me arriving. There's a perception about traffic safety. So everybody's familiar with level of service A, B, C, D, E, and F. Is anybody familiar with those terms? Level of service F is failure. Level of service D is potentially acceptable, but it has significant delays. A's and B's typically don't have delays. So if you had a project that had a level of service B, and a new, bigger project was coming in, and the neighborhood was extremely concerned about the safety and level of traffic that was going in. And Andy said that the perception of the neighborhood is a safety issue. But in some realistic terms, safety, you're gonna have a transportation expert who says that the roads are safe, the intersection and signalization is safe, but the level of service goes from a B to a C. That just means someone may queue at a light or a stop sign a little bit longer. And what Andy's saying, you have to kind of quantify the result that you're trying to say. You just can't say that the neighborhood is going to be inconvenienced, therefore I'm going to vote against this project. If there is a true concern about safety, that has to determine that. There, in instances where I think you would win, is if sightline was required on a road to be 300 feet for 80th percentile for the speed of a car, and the developer only had 300, and he's 50 feet short. I think you'd be on fairly solid ground to say no, because he's 50 feet short on a safety standard. If you said, even at 300 feet, I think cars drive too fast, that's an issue with traffic enforcement, not the posted speed limit and we'll say the mathematical evaluation of the road system. So what Andy's trying to say is you kind of need to quantify those. It can't be a feeling or opinion. It has to be, unfortunately, based on some type of documented fact, or if A occurs, B will happen. You know, and we've had those scenarios where the town engineer has said the drainage works, the consulting engineer has said it works, and a third-party engineer has said it works, but there were still some reservations from members of the board that it may not work, and what happens if they're all wrong? The difficulty is the
But we
test.
didn't deny it.
If you deny it, and
We
that,
didn't deny it.
correct, but if you did, to Andy's point, it's a feeling not supported by the record.
I mean, the only way you could do that is if you have two experts in front of you, dueling experts, then you're in great shape because you're the finder of fact. You get to choose who you believe. I don't know. I can't remember the name of the development, Maria. Many years ago, 20 years ago, a large residential subdivision, 80 or units, 100 units, and the question was nitrogen loading of the soil. And there was a URI professor who came in and said, nope, no problem with the nitrogen loading. And there was a University of Connecticut professor who came in representing the neighbors who said, yes, it's a problem. Two professors, and they used the same textbook too. They both had the same reference book. And I remember looking at it, and I couldn't figure out how they came to different conclusions, but they did. But that's the example with, no matter which way you rule, your decision will be upheld on something like that, because you had experts and you have the choice of choosing who you believe. But if you don't have that other expert, you can't. If your consulting engineer agrees with the applicant and says, you know, the person that you're hired agrees with the applicant that it's not going to be a problem, then you can't deny it on that basis.
So maybe this is where we need to consider using peer review more often, because you have basically the engineer or planner for hire that comes along with the applicant. And we have had instances in which projects that are 100 yards apart get completely different traffic interpretations or other that doesn't help the credibility.
And I think there's another thing you should consider with Susan's question about, well, why is it bad to go to SHAB and be denied and then have it come back, is that ultimately you now have a developer who has had his hands untied by SHAB, who basically said this can proceed in some format or another, and they've also expended time and resources taking that appeal to SHAB. They're not going to be as amenable on some of the things that you might want to see in that development as they might have been before they spent all that time and resources going to SHAB.
Well, that's my question.
Depends on if
That's my
they
question.
remand it in what
Yeah.
form, right?
Right.
And again, I've talked to a lot of the planning board members, so I'm picking up pieces in the question, but I think there's two aspects and when we're talking about comprehensive permits on an appeal. There's the instance where a planning board denies a comprehensive permit, and you would assume that the applicant's going to appeal that. There's also the second aspect is that a planning board approves a project and stipulates 10 conditions in that approval motion. I think this is where Susan may be concerned that if you have a project and you approve it with 10 conditions, and maybe 9 of them are really strong conditions, and 1 affects the financial return of the developer. So in that appeal to SHAB, what's the exposure of the planning board? I think it's all 10 conditions, not just the one difficult one. And I think that's some of the point is, if they're uncomfortable about a particular application or applicant, can they condition it to address some of those concerns?
It's my view that it is better to do it that way, that it is better to approve something with conditions than to deny it, unless you're really sure you're going to win on the denial. For that reason, because if you deny it, they can appeal to SHAB, and if it's overturned, then it's approved, and there's no conditions on the record, as noted. If you approve it with 10 conditions, and the applicant still has the ability, they can appeal, saying that those conditions make it infeasible, and they go to SHAB, and it's possible that SHAB could strike down some of those 10 conditions and say, yep, they're right, these conditions aren't reasonable, they make it unfeasible. But they might strike down 1 or 2 or 3, and you're still left with 7 conditions. It comes back to you, but you're left with the conditions. So in general, that's my advice, is to approve with conditions, if you possibly can, then deny it. I mean, if it's just so terrible and there's no compromise anywhere along, and there's no way to do it, then, okay, you can deny it. And we go, we fight, and part of it is just, the time factor. Taking it to SHAB, that does take a while now. Currently, going to the Superior Court, they're not quick either. That's dragging the developer down. Will they give in and compromise sooner while you're in court or before SHAB? And we've had those cases happen as well. There's a couple of dangers of denying things willy-nilly. Use a technical legal term. But it's like kind of the advice I give my children. The secret of life is picking your battles. If you do deny a lot, then you're going to get that reputation before SHAB. And it is going to be much harder to win the really important ones if you're denying other stuff. My exhibit A to that is the town of Barrington. And clearly, they denied stuff early on that was just based on nothing more than economic and class prejudice. And we don't want that in our town. And they denied stuff, and they were overturned by SHAB, and they fought all the way up to the Supreme Court. They were overturned. But now, consequently, when Barrington goes before SHAB for anything, it's just set up to lose. It's Barrington. You guys don't want anything. You would deny anything. So it does set you up there. It shouldn't. That's not anything you're going to read in the law book on the standards of what they apply, other than it does kind of, how are you, progress towards meeting your local needs. And it's like, well, what kind of progress if you're denying everything? So I think, again, you need to pick and choose your battles, which ones are really worth going all the way and fighting all the way to court for. And sometimes, sometimes it's the other way too, of saying, okay, well, if you're going to fight everything all the way, let's fight it, there's a reputation, and maybe the developers will realize they should be compromising up front, because you will be. I mean, unfortunately, I think with your town, you do have a wealthy enough town that they know that, we will fight on the things that we have to fight on. We have over the years.
Can I ask a follow-up
Wait,
question?
Robin's been waiting to
Sorry,
ask a question.
So a couple of things at this point now. So again, we already said that the town council could decide to appeal a SHAP decision on a denial or some conditions that we have imposed,
Right.
right? Okay, other topic then. In terms of our decisions being based on environmental concerns, I see absolutely no way that the town has any way to say that we know this about the environment, and we kind of just fall prey to there's a DEM permit or not. So I don't even think it's something that concerns us.
You're mostly correct. The state has preempted most environmental regulation with DEM, including the recent changes that took away, the ability to require special use permits if people were within, 150 feet of wetlands and stuff like that. That is now for DEM. The determination is that that's a state determination, or along the coast, it's a CRMC determination, not the town. It is very hard to determine it on environmental grounds. You'd have to have someone who's, really
We'd
being.
need, professionals. Can a town expand on a buffer requirement for, say, a wetland or a green corridor?
Not on any kind of wetland buffers, no. That's with DEM. The way you do it is in your overall planning, which I think this town has done a very good job over the years. You've essentially, created an urban sewer boundary, which is essentially an urban growth boundary. Or the facility, what do they call it? Facilities? Is it the? Right. So, you've done that. You've designated things, and going back a long time, and whether you like it or not, with the Route 1 Special Management District, whatever. But the idea is saying, okay, this is where we have facilities. This is where we have dense population already. This is where we want our growth to be. Here, we don't want it out in the turf fields. We don't want it on the coastal ponds. This is where we want our growth to be. So I think you've already done a good job, and that would certainly allow you, if someone came in and you wanted to put out, wanted to put some sort of big housing development, out in West Kingstown, beyond reach of the sewers and whatnot, I think then you'd have much better grounds. You'd be likely to be successful in denying it, because you've got that overall scheme. But if someone comes with an area within the service area and whatnot, and it's just like, well, that's a beautiful piece of green area and we'd like it to stay that way, but there's nothing else otherwise designating it for protection, no, you can't protect it.
Now, Robin mentioned buffers, which is not necessarily only wetland buffers. So isn't that something that we as a community can modify in our regulations, that we
Yes.
might require buffers in?
But realize, you're going to have to apply it to everyone.
Yes, of course.
And, and it's got to be realistic. You can't have buffers so wide that they're, taking away, there's no developable land
course.
left on the property with the overlapping buffers.
But that could be any buffer, wetland buffer, any buffer.
No, we're talking about basically property line buffers now, I think.
Okay.
You're saying, for your development, we want you to have a buffer. Yes, we do have various, most notably, like, again, Route 1, we've got the setbacks there. Kingston Road, the scenic district and whatnot, we've got various buffers and setbacks. And we have requirements for setbacks with subdivisions and land development projects now. If you wanted to increase the buffers, I would say that would do it is probably to increase the buffers on a sliding scale. The larger the development, the bigger the buffer gets. So that, a 5-lot subdivision doesn't have the same 100-foot buffer that a 50-lot subdivision would have.
Can I ask what the buffer is between Route 1 and residential property? Because it seems to be, you never used to be able to see the houses, and now you can see where they're building a new garage, and it seems like they're really coming right out to Route 1 as you approach Charleston.
there isn't a buffer, other than the front yard setbacks, there's not a buffer on most of Route 1, except for the Route 1 Special Management District.
Okay.
And I know there have been a few variances that have been granted, not a lot, but a few over the years for parking or lands, or, in the buffer area. But I know they were closely scrutinized as well.
Sorry, so I'll be really quick. I know that, okay, so I'm a
That's
little,
okay. I'm
I have-
here. It's up to you, and whatever else you want to talk about, it's up to you.
I have a lot of questions about comp permits
Up to
because,
the chair, excuse me.
comp permits. I've got so many questions about this. Of course, now I've blanked on my question. So let's just say we have a project come before us with a shopping list of waivers they're asking for. We're getting nothing from this developer. We're not getting green space, we're not getting recreation space, we're not getting any kind of love at all from this developer. The heels are dug in, we got nothing to lose. Do we have anything to lose? If we can come up with a legitimate reason to take our shot with Shab, do we have anything to lose if they've given us nothing? They haven't given us nicer shrubs, they haven't given us a playground, they haven't given us anything. What is the risk by going to Shab? If we have a... Is Jamie feeding you answers?
No.
Passing notes over there?
And I think maybe Susan was hoping to be somewhat more specific, like carrying capacity of the site or infrastructure, or something that you could
I
be
wouldn't
specific.
deny it because I don't like it. But if I
Right.
had a
It has to
legitimate
be
reason to
specific.
deny it, I feel now that I still have to approve everything that comes before us because I'm afraid of what's going to happen to us if we don't, and we get overturned. But if they've given us nothing, we don't want to get on Shab's bad side, but is there a risk to saying no because we're not going to lose anything? They're not giving us anything. They're giving us no love at all.
Okay, well, when put that way, it's not a good idea to deny it. I mean, because they don't have to give you anything. The question is, are all those things that they're not giving you a factor of the waivers that they're requesting? They're not giving you any green space because that's one of the waivers. They're just covering it all with buildings and things like that. If it's amenities that might otherwise be provided but aren't required, no, that isn't something to say just because they're not giving it to us, we're going to deny them.
But I think the reason I seek things is because I'm concerned about the bigger picture in the town that we live in. And we don't want to become Warwick and Cranston. And so if we permit that thing, which I know the community is going to totally rally against, because it's not in keeping with the spirit of our town. And that's not the reason I'm denying it.
Just-
I'm not denying
I
it.
think
for-
we're getting
Okay, well, first,
extremely specific about a particular
But I wasn't trying to.
live
I
application.
wasn't trying to be.
Well,
But I
ma-
guess we have other applicants that may come 5 years from now, and I don't understand how the comp permit and appeal system works.
May-
That's what
Maybe
I'm looking-
Andy can give us a broad idea of how he has seen in some communities in this situation, conditions that have been well-written that then mitigate some of the concerns.
nope. But I'm gonna, I don't know that I've seen that so much. It really is pretty much a case-by-case basis. I mean, and sometimes it does work. I mean, I not long ago represented in East Greenwich, there was a comprehensive permit for actually a fairly small development. I think it was, initially it was like started at 22, and it was down to like 12 or 13 units when it was denied. But it was denied, the planning board denied it. We went to Shab, we fought it out in Shab, we lost at Shab. Then the developer, though, rather than coming back and fighting out a long master plan process, no, I'm sorry. At that point, we appealed it to the Superior Court. And rather than go through another appeal level at the Superior Court, the developer said, okay, what can we do? What can we do to change it? And, okay, now it's down to 8 units as opposed to that. And, so sometimes it does work to fight it out. But there were particulars that were, in that case, it was a particular historic resource that was one of the main things that was able to be defensible on that, at least give us grounds to do it. I'm going to come back to your other question about you don't want this to be like Warwick or Cranston. And the answer for that, and you don't want to hear it, is tough luck. That's not what the legislature has mandated. The legislature currently, and everything, as Maria knows better than anyone else here in the room, is up for grabs this year, and who knows what's going to happen with any of this stuff. But as it stands now, the legislature adopted this. They adopted it in the early 1990s, and the initial name, the actual, this is modeled after a bill, an act in Massachusetts for affordable housing, what they call their 40B, but it was called the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. That's what it is, that's what it was, that's what it is. That's what it's designed for, the idea that it is the legislature, and in Rhode Island, the General Assembly is the overriding thing. You can have a charter to run your own affairs in the town, but that's subject to the General Assembly approving it, as well as your own voters. So they've said, whether we like it or not, that every community needs to have 10% affordable housing, and they've also come up with a cockamamie definition of affordable housing, like 30 years protection, which to me is one of the stupidest things, because all we've done is created a 30-year time bomb. If you're going to do it, at least make it permanent or something like that. But this is what they did. They said 10% and 30-year protection, and you got to have some sort of restrictions and municipal subsidy. You got to have affordable as they define affordable, and that's what they have. And every community is required to deal with it and plan with it, and that's why they amended the Comp Plan Act to require every town to come up with a housing element in their comprehensive plan and tell us, calculate what your 10% was or is and how you're going to get to it. And that's what the scheme is. And then it's up for you to do it. And as I said, I mean, I think South Kingstown overall has done a very good job in protecting a great deal of the land area of the community by looking at it, looking where your resources is. It's good planning. It's smart growth 101. Where's your infrastructure? Where are your transportation and your sewer and water? And that's where you have your growth. And the fact of the matter is, those places are going to become denser. And they may become more like Warwick and Cranston. And it's up for you. You can determine where. That's one of the things a lot of communities, pick out. You've got a node, say this is a node for future affordable housing. These are the places. It doesn't mean that people can't apply for comprehensive permits in places that aren't nodes. But again, if the town has said this is where we think it would be a good place to have this increased density in affordable housing, then you can't change your mind afterwards when someone comes in and files an application for it. But that is part of the element about it. So if you're going to rely on not wanting to change the character of the community, you're going to lose. And that's where you're going to lose. And then, as I said, I think the more you lose before SHAB, the more you lose. You're going to get a reputation of not doing it. I'm not saying go for everything. There's some worth fighting for. But choose what you're going to fight. And where all possible, try to have some particular health and safety of the residents issue that you can rely on, or something unique like a historic preservation element, rather than just this is bad for the environment because it's more housing there. Now, as I said, things may even get more. It may be that everybody may be able to have an affordable, an accessory dwelling unit on their property. That may be one of the changes that may be coming forward and whatnot. Things like that may happen. But looking at your comp permits, you've really got to have something a lot more specific and definable in order to say no, even if the developer has been a jerk and hasn't offered you anything. And the good news is, just for the record, I haven't been coming to your regular working meetings. I've only been coming to your approval meetings. I've been coming to the workshop. So I don't even know what one you're talking about. So I feel I could safely say this. No, I know, but I mean, others may think you are or not, but I'm just saying, even if you are, I have no idea. So I'm just saying this all in general. But I am saying, based on your language, the language that you're using is totally not effective to appeal any of, to deny this or appeal it.
I think it's what the planning, I've gotten to know the planning board members since I've been here. Everybody is passionate and concerned about how the community grows, how the community develops. And this town historically has spent a significant amount of hours, financial resources, in planning for the future development of the community. And I think what Susan, as well as other members, struggle with is there's this process that the legislator created that says all of that good planning, the $100,000+ you spent doing a comprehensive community plan, that has to be updated, which means you're gonna spend another 6 figures 10 years from now updating that plan. And you'll probably have to have a larger housing component. And it's probably coming. Connecticut just passed a requirement that every single municipality, or 169 of them, has to either have a housing affordability plan in each community or roll that into their comprehensive plan. They call it community development plans in Connecticut, POCDs. But I think it's just struggling that you take a 4-acre lot or an R80 zone that the town, because of resources, because of access to EMS, to services, to transportation issues, zoned a piece of land R80. You didn't intend to do that from an exclusionary standpoint. You did that based on a natural resources and infrastructure analysis. And then a developer potentially gets to come in on that 2-acre piece where one house, according to all your planning endeavors, says should be built, and propose 10. And to Andy's point, the planning board struggles when the developer doesn't show significant landscaping, doesn't deal with a more appropriate development style, and it's more traditional cookie cutter. And the planning board is standing in front of the neighbors who are saying, how can this happen? Traffic on my street's going to increase. I'm going to see these houses. My life savings was put into my house thinking that I was protected because I was in an R80 zone. And it's a struggle for the planning boards. But I think Andy's point is that the legislator set the table this way. And it's unfortunate and South Kingstown's not the only community that is affected by this. But unless you really have those health, safety, public welfare, that your storm drainage is going to fail, someone is going to be injured. And, I've gone through 2 Supreme Court cases where I thought the municipalities we were working in had pretty poignant safety issues with regards to vehicular collisions that could occur. And the judge, the planning board made determinations in these cases that we didn't feel comfortable approving this because our consultants are telling us there is a safety issue here. Their consultants are saying there isn't. And in the end, the Supreme Court said the need for affordable housing outweighs even a public safety issue because you can't prove that someone would actually be harmed. There's only the likelihood that someone may be harmed. And it was hard for these planning and zoning commissions in Connecticut to deal with that. But the standard's pretty high for that health, safety, public welfare kind of overturn. But I know it's a struggle. As a planner, I've struggled with it for 30+ years.
And I think the folks that come before us who have made their largest lifetime investment in their property, and they have purchased a property that they rely on the town as having zoned a particular area, and then they basically find out through this process that
It's been unzoned.
an unzoned, yes.
Unzoned.
That's, difficult for us to explain.
Because as a community, you couldn't go in and change the zoning category for that one piece of land. It'd be called spot zoning. And that's typically deemed to be illegal and not allowed, yet the comprehensive plan allows residential spot zoning. But to Andy's point, the process allows them to utilize that permitting avenue.
Can I ask one more question? I'll keep it really quick. So if we are pretty much needing to approve any comprehensive permit that comes before us, is there any power that we have to improve the project? You know, like, must we accept the project as it is presented? Because, do we have any power or authority to try to make it more consistent with our?
And that's why I was suggesting the conditions.
But-
That's why I was,
But if they say no,
well, they don't have to agree to the conditions.
Right.
They don't have to agree to the conditions. You can impose conditions whether they agree to them or not. And they can appeal those conditions to SHAB. But at least my view is you've got a better shot at either prevailing overall in SHAB or at least a partial win at SHAB, because you might keep some of your conditions and not lose all of them.
And
So,
think back to,
and also, again,
multiple, yeah.
if you put the conditions in, and again, and you go through and get overturned and appeal to court, at that point, if they know what the conditions are that they have to settle on, they're more likely to settle later on in the process and say, okay, you got 1 through 10, we'll give you everything but 7 and 3 or something like that. They know what it is. If it's just a denial, there's no room for them to come back except come back full steam with everything. So that's kind of my best solution there, is to impose the conditions
that's
that
really helpful.
mitigate
Thank you.
the problems.
Thank you.
But there's some conditions you can't impose, right? If they come in and they say they want 70 units, can we say you got a condition no more than 40?
You can if it's based on something. That's you can't say, I think 70 is too many. If you can say that, for example,
recharge area
with,
or-
right, because of the extra units, there's not enough room for your, on-site retainage for runoff, although they probably have an expert there. But if you can say, for example, that there's not sufficient green space in areas, let's say it's a family development. You're not providing playgrounds, you're not providing any family amenities because you've taken up every inch with buildings, then it makes sense to say, okay, well, there should be less units so that you can provide more of this for the health. But it's for the health and benefit of those residents that they have some of those amenities and more space. So if you have some particular reasoning, yes, you can have a condition that's less units. And they don't have to agree to that condition, but you can still impose it as long as you've got some rationale behind why you're imposing it. Let's just say hypothetically, if you've got a traffic report and the level of service is B now, and the traffic report and your engineer, if they build 70 units, the traffic service is going to go to D. But if they only build 40 units, the traffic service is going to go to C. That would be a reason to say that. That's something that you can quantify an impact. So yes, there's still going to be an impact, but it's not going to a really bad impact of a D or an F.
I know we're beating this, but where the real gap is, or the conundrum is that on one hand, we want to feel like we're balancing the needs of the community versus the impacts of the community, and that itself tends to be very subjective and a continuum. Whether it's 25% density increase, 50 or 400, it's going to be a different impact. Then, but on the other hand, the actual review, whether we approve it or not, is very binary. It's very, and it's not subjective, it's very objective of whether they have an engineer that says it's safe and, it's environmentally sound. So that's where the conundrum is. We have this feeling that we have this responsibility to balance, but the tool is which is very subjective and a continuum, but the tool is binary and objective. Do they have an engineer or not that says it's safe and it's environmentally sound? So, I mean, we're struggling on the same thing, but that's what it really comes down to. You know, we may feel that a 400% increase is way too high. It's not even consistent with anything else we've seen. Everything else is 25%, 50%, maybe 100%. And here comes the development that says 400. So we feel from the balance side that we're not getting that balance. But from the tool side, they got an engineer and it's binary. So
Yeah.
that's the
Well, one of the good things of one of the pending bills that I liked was something that I think was going to cap the density increase of comprehensive permits at either 50 or 100%, but there was going to at least be a cap to it as opposed to one unlimited. But I think the key is it depends on the site. Maybe you haven't seen a 400% density increase before, but, you know, if the site is big enough and can otherwise handle it, I don't think you can just say, you know, 400% is not the norm, it's so unusual. You've got to look at the quantifying and saying, what is the effect of 400%? What is the effect of not just the number of units are 4 times more, but now the lot coverage is 10 times more or something like that? That's what you've got to look at, what the effect is of that density increase.
Can we look at, so maybe some things associated with, I guess, I'm not sure if it's environmental and safety, but, I mean, now we start looking at, now you have 400% increase, so there's no area for open space, there's no area for recreation, there's no area for children to play and gather. That doesn't directly fit into safety and environmental, but is that grounds to say the balance is, you know, the balance isn't there?
I think it is, particularly if you're imposing a condition, if you're not just denying it outright, but imposing a condition that there be less units so that, and that those things be provided.
So what's their recourse if
Okay.
we did say, what do they do next? The day when they walk out of here and we say, you can't have 300 units, you can only have 200, and we want to see a playground. What do they do with that answer?
Well, they either accept it, or they go to SHAB and appeal and say that makes their project financially unfeasible.
So can I summarize, sorry? So I feel like we're saying most of the decisions for denial come from our planning staff, not from the planning board. It's black and white numbers and traffic numbers, and you know, that's the thing that the administrative people do. And the only way that we get to make a final decision is if there are 2 opposing experts in front of us, and without that opposing expert, we're pretty much, our hands are tied,
For a comprehensive permit, yes.
or anything.
Not necessarily for anything. If someone is asking for waivers, if they're just a regular old subdivision or land development and they're asking for waivers, you actually have more latitude, and, you know, because good planning practice is a kind of subjective standard, and you have your own expert who can say, in their opinion, it's not good planning practice to grant this waiver.
That's what I mean, that it's really up to them.
Well, or like the local knowledge, when you have someone who's in a butter who happens to be a biologist who said, that lot is actually a pond, and we've been catching pollywogs in there for 20 years. And then, despite the fact that their wetlands experts signed off on it, it actually was a pond when we went out to the site.
Importance of site visits.
Yes. What, have you seen any examples of projects where often we feel as though in this balancing act, the math doesn't work because you've got 25 and 70, you've got 25 affordable, yet you have 75 market rate. So how are we going to ever catch up? So have you seen examples where there was a negotiation of sorts whereby a community was able to convince an applicant that they should up the number of affordable units?
Yes, I have. That's often part of the part of the negotiation. It's like, okay, if we're gonna have 100 units, well, let's have more than 25 affordable. Again, I don't think it's something you can deny.
Right.
Can't deny it on it, because the law says they have to have a minimum of 25%.
Can we make it a condition?
Pardon me?
Can we make
No, I don't think you can't make that a condition unless you can somehow tie it to something else, which I don't know how you can tie it to. Because the condition is, not meeting local needs, but by definition, if they have 25%, they are meeting it for that aspect of it.
But we could talk them up.
You can try, yeah. You can talk them up and trade other things for it and so forth, yeah. And they obviously, in the end, they would prefer to have your approval and not waste the time and money going to SHAB, or not spend the time and money going to SHAB. So they'd prefer to have your approval. So you can.
So I have another question. Are all affordable units created equal? Or is there a more desirable affordable unit which has open space, public transportation, access to amenities, bigger, smaller? Is every affordable unit the same in the eyes of the law? Or are some, more desirable or,
Better design.
yeah,
Well, I guess that's, as to your 10%, they're all equal. You're right. A 3-bedroom in a nice community with a playground and whatnot is counted the same as the studio apartment. To get to 10%, they're each one unit towards that number you need for your 10%. Obviously, as a practical matter, it's like all real estate. It's, none, by definition, that's why we allow specific performance for real estate, because it's presumed to be unequal, everyone's unique, and people get to, some of them are nice and not, and
There was
location.
a rubric that we saw, right? And it was, each category is worth 10, although they didn't describe how you would assign the points. That would just bring those kinds of considerations in.
so is affordable housing that is inaccessible to public transportation, say? Okay. Where you're saying that the folks with the affordable housing must own a car, or they,
Well-
is that a reason for denial? Or is there something else at
Part of the
play?
negotiation versus.
Something like that, I think, like I said, I really do think that a lot of the key to it is infrastructure. And I do think, if it's something that's totally inaccessible, and, the only way to get there is a car and whatnot, I don't think you can rely on that alone.
Right.
Because, I think as a practical matter, most people, even people with affordable housing, just because, at least in this state, the poor nature of our public transportation system kind of mandates that you have a car no matter what. So I don't think that can be a sole reason for denial, but it can certainly be a factor. The other big factors I would say would be, sewer and water service. Those are the easy ones to deny lack of it if you're, again, because it ties into your whole scheme of, you've said where you want your development, where you have those services, and if they're putting it out there and, on septic systems and loading up a lot with septic systems, then that can be one of the factors weighing into it.
But if they came armed with their DEM permit for their OWTS system that'll
Right.
manage that whole site,
That's right.
even if it's wet, they have a permit,
They do.
and that's it.
So you can't use it. If they've already gotten their permit, you can't use it.
So let's let Andy move on to the next slide.
No more questions for me, sorry.
No, you can, just,
I will say this, though, just so you know from a time perspective. I believe my charging cord wasn't working, so that's why my laptop died. So anything associated with mixed use is on this laptop that will not turn on.
good to
So,
know.
so you have, I would say, the rest of the evening for legal.
Yeah, I want to go home
Yes and
too.
no.
I know you typically set 9 o'clock as your stop point.
All right. So let's, I've got this slide up here now, because if I got nothing else, I wanted to remind you all, make sure all of you have submitted your statement to the Ethics Commission by their April 30th deadline. And if you haven't, do it now. They don't care. They're not going to fine you if you get it to them in May. You have to ignore a couple of notices, and it has to be out until July before they start getting really angry with you. So if you haven't done it, don't feel, oh my God, I missed it and I'm never going to get to it. Just do it now and get it in. And the other thing too is you can always change it. If you get something, want to change it, you can always amend it later. But get your ethics disclosure statement in. So that was one of the things I wanted to make sure if I got nothing else in that I mentioned.
That was easy compared to taxes.
So I think we'll go back a bit here, and then we will pick up. I'm going to talk about due process, and this was kind of where we had left off here, where we had started about boards and commissions, and where the power comes from, coming from the state enabling to your municipal regulations to your own guidelines and rules of procedure. These are your ordinances here, your main statutes, rather, that control the Comprehensive Planning Act, the Zoning Enabling Act, the Development Review Act. And then just on the right are other things out there that are not quite as significant but still impact it. 4522 is just, the particular makeup of the planning board or commission and joint planning commissions. The Impact Fee Act, which puts requirements if you're going to collect impact fees, how you do it, map streets, historical area zoning, wastewater management districts, and soil erosion and sediment control. Those are all things that impact the big ones. And then the other big one, kind of the fourth one of the big three, is the Low and Moderate Income Housing Act, which I think we've talked about for enough for now. And this is just kind of showing you how they flow downhill, if you will. So with your power comes the requirement to provide due process. And due process is really just fairness. That's what we're talking about. And it's to ensure that government does not abuse its power by acting in an arbitrary, capricious manner. And there's two types of due process. Substantive due process is based on the content and the law. You're tasked with evaluating a project fairly against applicable regulations, regardless of personal preferences. So this is really what we've just been talking about for the past hour or more. That idea, you have to use those standards in the law. You have to be able to articulate why you don't like something. If you can't articulate the reasons why you don't like it and justify it, then you can't deny it. That's substantive due process. One of the big things, I'll jump back, perhaps it's the historian in me, I spend too much time, but going back in with the Land Use Commission, of which I was a member in the 90s, that was writing this law and whatnot with all these people, and there were a lot of developers on it. And the constant theme was, tell me what the rules are. I'm less concerned about what your rules are as the ability to know what your rules are and that they're not going to change. Tell me what I have to do. Tell me what I have to do to meet your rules. I'll meet your rules. Don't change them in the middle. That was one of the big things. And as I mentioned, planning boards were given a lot more power with the Development Review Act in 1992. But the quid pro quo was this requirement for basing your actions on objective standards. That's something that's ingrained in the law going back those 20-some years. Procedural due process is not dealing, no matter the substance, whether it's zoning, planning, historic district, whatever, but notice and an opportunity to be heard. You act in a quasi-judicial capacity, applying these ordinances and the regulations. They're the law you apply, and so the people have the right to have notice of what you're doing and have an opportunity to be heard. Now, that opportunity to be heard is not unlimited. It's governed by the various statutes with the public meetings and so forth. But within those meetings, they have the right to be heard, and that's that they have a reasonable right that, your decision is not made before they get there. And what you're doing is balancing the individual rights versus the community rights. and applying the standards. Ethics, there's a lot of this stuff I'm not going to really go into, basically common sense stuff, listen with an open mind, whatnot. But it ties in with this due process stuff that I was just saying. Due process comes with the idea that if someone comes and stands up there and speaks to you, you don't necessarily have to agree with them, but you have to be open to hearing what they're saying. That's the key thing. That your mind's not made up beforehand, which we call bias, and that you haven't had that bias put in by some sort of outside contact. The basic concept of our ethics statute, public meeting statute, and public record statute is that the public's business is conducted in public. There's no discussion, let alone decision, of these things within your public purview without the opportunity to the public to at least see and hear you doing it. They don't always have the opportunity to speak up. That's defined by the individual statutes at specific times, but they always have the right to hear and see what you're saying as you're talking about it and making the decision. That's the whole aspect of it, behind it, the goal, the public transparency. Whether it's your ethics disclosure form, if you have some financial interest, people have the right to know what your financial interest is when you're up there deciding, or whether it's public meetings with providing notice and whatnot, they have that right to get that notice of the meeting. Ex parte communications are probably the biggest problem with this, and ex parte simply means outside the item, outside that setting of the meeting. A public official is contacted by an individual group with an interest in the outcome. It's outside the meeting, and there's an attempt to secure their vote or opinion. And it doesn't have to be a real quid pro quo. You should vote for this or whatnot. But there is some issue of influencing it. And we have a couple of scenarios here. You're going to look at a site, and you encounter a neighbor, and the neighbor starts talking to you about it. Or the one that is the quintessential Rhode Island one, the supermarket, or perhaps now it's the coffee shop. You run into someone, you're a member of the planning board, someone comes up to you, Susan, you're on the planning board. I've been reading in the paper about the proposed assisted living facility off Green Street. I think it sounds like something we really need here in town. What do you think? Or maybe they don't even add the what do you think. So what do you do in these situations? What you need to do is you need to be politely putting an end to the conversation as soon as it begins about, I can't talk to you about it. If it's something that's before you or that you reasonably expect to come before you, or if it was just recently before you and might come back to you on appeal or something like that, you want to say, I can't talk to you about it. If you have an opinion or view, you need to come to the meeting. In fact, it's next Tuesday night. Why don't you come to the meeting? Express, oh, I can't come Tuesday night. That's my bridge night. Or that's Little League. I can't come. Great. Put it in writing. Send a letter. Oh, I'll send it to you. No, don't send it to me. Send it to the staff. One of the things you need to do as planning board members is you need to memorize, whoever it is, Jamie or Jay's, you need to memorize their email so that anywhere you are, on the ball field, on the soccer field, in the supermarket, when someone comes up to you, you're able to give them, that person, Jay's email and say, send it to him. Let him get the correspondence. It'll get into the record. Have them send the correspondence there. Then it's not ex parte communication. That's what you need to do with people. If they can't come, they don't want to come and speak up, send it in writing, send it to the staff. Well, let me just finish. So I think it's also important, it's not just a helpful thing that you can say to add in is saying, I've got to keep an open mind on this, so I can't talk to you about it. Otherwise, I might not be able to vote when it comes up. And I think that's a nice way of getting people to shut up. Because if they thought they were going to influence your vote, and so they must think that you're probably on their side to begin with, and suddenly they realize they might lose your vote if they talk to you, that that helps to get them to stop talking and not keep fighting with you, if you tell them that. You gotta keep an open mind. If I don't, I can't vote when it comes up, you know? So that's a helpful thing. So, now, go ahead, what's your? Right. It's a fuzzy line. I mean, if there's a big piece for sale that you think is going to be sold and is going to be developed, then that's probably something you shouldn't talk about, because there's a reasonable likelihood it's going to come before you sometime in the near future. If it's just in general, you know, we need more green space in town. We got to have more ball fields. We need more artificial turf playing fields. Whatever it is, you know, in a general sort of thing, absolutely. But if it's something, you know, as I said, a reasonable expectation, I can't give you a hard and fast line on it. But I would say your example of a large piece of property that has a for sale sign on it, you probably shouldn't be discussing it, because there's a good shot it's going to come before you.
My prime example of that is, Susan, to your point, this actually happened in a community maybe 15 years ago that I was doing some work in, where during the public hearing, a larger piece of land was sold, and during the public hearing, a neighbor said, and I'm just going to use Maria's name, but I don't understand this. When I talked to Maria Mack a month ago, she said she wasn't in favor of any development of that piece of land. Now, how do you unexplain that? Okay, and a month ago, Maria had no idea that a development was coming in. She was just chatting with a neighbor at a Little League game about a big piece of land that was for sale. So that's a real example of where someone very innocently had a discussion on a large tract of land that didn't even think it would have an implication in the future, but yet a few months later in an application process, someone said, oh, but remember when we talked at the Little League game, you said you weren't in favor of any development there? How can you even contemplate voting yes on this? Now, potentially that makes Maria ineligible, because, to me, you're handing the applicant a potential appeal, because they would claim you're prejudiced. There was testimony during the public hearing that you've already decided 2 months ago you didn't want this property to be developed. So it is a fine line. Brian, myself, Jay, we're always available to have a conversation with you. That's not considered ex parte. You're talking to staff about the development potential of a future parcel.
And even in a situation like, we haven't had a lot of them, but when you have a group site visit, which is then posted as a meeting, so the public knows it's going on, you don't have any conversations with folks that might tag along. You can ask questions of staff or whoever might be showing you the parcel, the applicant, but you don't engage with them.
Right, that's an example of where they have the right to see and hear what you're seeing and hearing, but they don't have a right to speak. Not every meeting is a public meeting, but not every public meeting is a public hearing. Public hearings are specifically defined by the statute. So let me come back to this example here in the ex parte. So the follow-up is this person that you ran into in the supermarket does send the email to you, or someone you've never even met in the supermarket or whatever, but someone sends you an email. The old days would be a letter. They send you an email with how they feel about this particular project or something like that. Now, you're the recipient of this ex parte communication. What do? You cure it by exposing it to the light. You take it, you forward it to Jay and say, I got this email, I'm forwarding it to you, please, whatever, print it out, put it in the file. Now it's no longer an ex parte communication. It's in there, it's part of the record for everyone to see. So that's what I recommend if you get any of those unsolicited things. If you get something, I guess it's pretty hard, but you can get, if you get an anonymous thing, I don't think you necessarily have to do that. You can if you want, or you can or you can just delete it. It's kind of like you get an anonymous letter, you could just throw it out.
Spam
You don't
filter,
have to do it. Now, I think it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is stay off of public social media, and particularly any kind of comment thing. Don't comment on social media posts. And my advice to you is don't have type of social media posts that allow comments on your end. And this can work both ways. And I was recently at a seminar, a legal seminar about this and the law and whatnot. A lot of politicians, they'll have a website and they allow people to comment on it. And there's the most vile, terrible stuff that suddenly starts coming in on their comments about them. And they cannot block. They legally can't block the people who are doing that. There is no safe harbor that I can tell you, if you allow people to comment, then you are going to be stuck allowing anybody to say anything if you allow people to comment. I can't tell you a safe harbor that will allow you some way that you can block it that won't end up having you sued successfully by someone who's upset with you. So the best thing is just not to have the comments there, and don't you comment on social media platforms or anything like that. So that's my overall advice on that. Email communications, don't use reply all. If you have the opportunity, don't use it. And if you're sending something, as it was said, any communication, you can talk to me, you can talk to Jamie, you can talk to Jay. That's not ex parte communication. You can talk to us. It's only when you start talking to each other that it happens. And there's this thing that has the funny name of a rolling quorum, or some they call it a walking quorum, where one person talks to another person, who then talks to a third person and the fourth, and before you know it, there's a quorum of the planning board that has effectively discussed this idea serially. And that's what's, illegal. So, and the problem with reply all is it happens innocently. I've seen it. Starts off, the one thing you can use electronic communications like this for, without any open meeting stuff with the board members, is scheduling. So Jamie sends out an email. We're trying to schedule the site visit for the Smith property. Who's available this Saturday or next Saturday? And people start responding, I'm not available. Someone else says, I'm not available on this Saturday, but I really want to go next Saturday because I've heard there's really a lot of wetlands there. And then someone else responded and said, well, I could make Saturday also, but I don't think there are wetlands there. I think it's dry. Well, now you've suddenly got a discussion of the substance of the matter out of the sight of the public here. Totally innocently triggered, but that's why it's best not to use it at all. So one of our best practices we talk about is for, if you're sending out scheduling and whatnot to everybody, blind copy all the members, so they can't even accidentally reply all. They have to deliberately type in every name if they want to somehow reply all. So I'm going to talk about conflicts here. Did I skip over something here? I guess not. Maybe it's later. The basic thing with conflict of interest. No, it's here. Okay. So a conflict of interest may exist if an official can reasonably expect that his or her official conduct will directly result in financial benefit or negative financial impact to him, herself, family, business associates, employees, or businesses that the official represents. The conflict need not be certain to occur, but the probability must be greater than conceivably. So this is the big thing about the ethics and the conflicts. So at first it sounds fine. Well, I'm not going to get any financial benefit from this, so I don't have a conflict. No, first of all, it's more, I'm not going to get a financial benefit, or I'm not going to be financially harmed either. No financial impact. The second thing is, it's not just you. It spreads out in all directions. First of all, it's your family. And your family is defined as going up to your grandparents, down to your grandchildren and out to your first cousins. Those are all your family. It doesn't matter if you got 11 first cousins and you really have no contact at all with this first cousin. But if one of your first cousins lives within the radius area, notice area for a particular project, then you've got a conflict because it's deemed to be your conflict with your family. And in fact, the regulations, the ethics commissions have even adopted it to changing issues with gender and more than that. It doesn't even have to be someone related. If someone lives in your household, that's presumed to be a family member as well, that you'd have a conflict. If someone's living in your home, that's a family member as well for conflict. Business associates, people that you, either your employer or employees, or if you're independent, people you work with regularly, but it's got to be some sort of regular thing. It often comes up when I hear people say like, well, I bought a house and he was my real estate agent. Is that a conflict? Well, if you bought the house 3 years ago and that was the only time you dealt with that real estate agent, no, that's not a business associate. If you're a real estate developer and you buy and sell houses 1 or 2 or 3 a year, and this is the agent that you use regularly, again, are you foreseeably going to use them again in the future? That's a business associate, and if they would have it. The other thing, too, is this goes to nonprofits. If you're a board member at the YMCA and they're coming in for some sort of thing, you have a conflict of interest. Now, there is a nice bright line there that the Ethics Commission has drawn. You have to be either a board member or an officer or in some form of authority in the group to have a conflict. So if you're a board member of the Y, if you're a member of the church building committee and the church is coming in to build something, then you have a conflict. If you are just a member of the congregation of the church or just a member of the Y, then you don't have that conflict. That's why even on that Ethics Commission form, if you are an officer or a board member of a nonprofit entity, you're supposed to list it on the Ethics Commission annual report as well. And that's taken a lot of people by surprise, including when it came out, me as well. I was surprised as well, but you need to do that. So it affects it that way. So that's the thing, it spreads out in that area. And then these are the situations where you have a conflict that you must recuse. There are other situations that you may decide you want to recuse anyway just because of the appearance. This person has no relationship to you whatsoever, but this is your best friend from high school, and you go out every Thursday, for drinks after work or whatever. This is your best friend. That's the sort of thing you should be recusing from, even if you don't have to, because of the appearance of impropriety. If you're recusing, what do you have to do? You have to fill out a form. We've got the forms, should be available at all the meetings. You fill out the form that says, I need to recuse myself because Joe Smith applicant is my first cousin, so I have to recuse. There is a spot on the form that says, I'm not recusing and I can fairly hear it because. And that might be the sort of thing where if you've got some sort of close contact with someone but you think you can still fairly hear it, you might do it. I advise you to use it very sparingly, but I do tell you it's there. Generally, if in doubt, recuse, unless there's going to be something like no quorum and you're going to totally stop everything in its tracks, it's better to recuse. My example is, how would you feel if what you're about to do is going to be all across Facebook tomorrow morning? And, your spouse, your children are going to see this. When in doubt, it's better to recuse. And just so you know, a copy of that form is kept on file with the board, and a copy goes to the Ethics Commission.
So if you know an attorney that comes before the board often, then you would have to recuse yourself often?
Not if you know them. No, the question is, do you hire them as your attorney?
Okay.
And again, that would be the thing. Did the attorney who's before the board represent you on a house closing more than a year ago? Or did the attorney represent you 5 years ago when you did your will, 3 years ago when you adopted a child and a year ago when you had your house closing, and therefore you're going to probably call them and get, that's where you should recuse. Or even if you don't, that would be a good thing where you would say, use the second part and say, I have used attorney X in the past, but I don't see, he's not, I don't have an ongoing relationship with him, therefore I think I can continue to serve. That's the big thing, as I said, sunlight disclosure, that the public knows what your biases are more than that you don't necessarily have, and I'm using bias kind of like with a small b there, not the legal term, but just, we all have our biases and our views, and they want to know, they have a right to know what might be the things that are driving you. If you recuse, get up, leave the table. You can't stay at the table. If you recuse, you can't just say, oh, I won't vote. I'll participate in the discussion in question. You can't even sit at the table. If you're recused, get up. Best thing, leave the room. Ideally, or leave the building. If it's, the only item that night or the last item, go home. Or go to Foxwoods, whatever, but get out of the building. Next thing, leave the room. If you want to stay and hear it, sit in the back. Don't sit in the front row. There was a complaint. So Little Compton is the setting, the Little Compton Town Council. And the Little Compton Town Council chambers are about the size of from that wall to your table. That's about the size, the length, maybe a little bit wider. And they have these old-fashioned, uncomfortable colonial benches, about half a dozen of them, and this square, this U-shaped table up front. And so if you're sitting in the front row there, you're about 3 feet away from the closest council member. And the town council president, the woman who ran the town for many years, recused from something, walked around and sat in the front row, and then proceeded to make faces and hand gestures throughout the meeting, and there was a complaint against her which was upheld. So that's what I'm saying. Don't take the chance. Just, if you're staying around, sitting back. You don't have to leave the room. Well, I recommend it. I recommend it. I think that's the best policy, is leaving the room. But I can't say that you legally have to leave the room. But if you don't, and, this is a big room, just go sit in the back row. That's what you need to do.
Yeah, again, Peter, if you leave the room, it's very difficult for anyone to say, as a planning board or a member of the public, I think their mere presence or the gestures they were making, yeah.
Okay, so no, they're wrong. You don't have to leave the room. Right. The law is you definitely have to leave the table and the rostrum. You can't be seen as part of, up there. Even if you said nothing whatsoever, the public can't see you there. When in the Zoom days, what I used to tell people, if you're recusing on Zoom, I'd say, turn off your microphone and turn off your camera. I don't want people to see you on the, if you're recused, turn off your camera. That was the equivalent of leaving the room. You can still listen and watch, but don't let people see you. So that's recusal, not to be confused with abstaining. Abstaining is just because you don't particularly want to vote on something. You don't feel that you're adequately prepared to vote on something is really the only justifiable reason for abstention. And that could happen. So as planning board members, you do not have to be present for every meeting that takes place. Your stuff goes over multiple months. If you miss a meeting, you can still participate in the next one, provided that you acquaint yourself with what happened at the meeting you missed. If it's videotaped, you watch it on Zoom, you watch the tape of the meeting. If you listen to the tapes, you read the minutes, look at all the exhibits that were submitted, and then at the beginning of the next meeting, you state on the record, I've listened to the tapes, read the minutes, and read all the exhibits, and I feel comfortable in continuing to hear this. And you can. But if for some reason you didn't, maybe you were, you missed the meeting and you were on vacation and you were on vacation in Europe, and you just got back the night before this next meeting, which is the meeting in the boat, and you certainly didn't want to spend your vacation reading minutes of this meeting and whatnot, and you haven't had time and you're here, that would be a good example to say, okay, I'm going to abstain because I'm not familiar, I didn't have a chance to familiarize myself with the last meeting, I wasn't here, I'm going to abstain from this vote. That would be the kind of example that I would anticipate with abstaining. Now, people might say, well, you know, I'm kind of friendly with that guy, so I think I'm going to abstain. That you shouldn't do. Either you should recuse, get up, leave completely, or you should vote. You shouldn't abstain just because you have some lesser feelings one way or another towards someone. So, questions on abstention and recusal? Okay. You want to quit now on this, or what's your pleasure? Well, yeah, although it's going to be hard to squeeze it all into an hour, but.
Yeah, I think we had a
But
lot more
essentially,
questions
yeah,
than-
essentially, you've got an hour from the requirements. I can squeeze it because there's a lot of stuff later that we've already covered when we talked about all the decisions and the comp plan stuff. So there's a lot of stuff later that we've already covered. And there's a lot of stuff that, you know, is statewide planning stuff. You don't need to know all the structure of statewide planning and Nancy Hess and whose job is in statewide planning. We can skip that. So, yeah, I think just a little over an hour, I should be able to complete it at a future thing, if you want.
Great. Thank you, Andy.
Okay?
So we are going to, due to technical issues, we're going to skip the mixed-use development form-based code architectural conversation this evening. Is that correct, Jamie? You'd rather have the
I would
conversation
prefer to, Madam Chair.
Yes, the PowerPoint. Planning Board liaison, does anyone have anything they'd like to share with the board? With regard to liaison?
It's up to you. It doesn't matter. Or not.
Okay. Do we have any update from staff?
Just a couple of quick things that happened in the past month, well, 2 weeks. The town did apply for 2 grants for Rhode Island Commerce. They applied for a little over $600,000 for streetscape improvements in Wakefield and Peacedale as part of a $850,000 program. We also applied for facade improvements for the Matunic Market, which is the potential redo of the old Feet First building. Again, the application on those facade improvements have no bearing on any potential future application to the planning board or the zoning board. We're still working out the permitting aspects of that project. The other aspect is stewardship committee. I have a meeting scheduled next Monday with the potential planning consultant on the Route 1 plan. I also met with Don Powers from Union Studios as the potential architect for the town's EMS building on Ministerial Road. So those 2 RFQs are moving forward. I have, I want to say, a final first cut draft of the form-based code kind of zoning analysis of Old Tower Hill with regards to future development and design standards associated with mixed use along that corridor. And again, we may be applying and continue to apply for as much grant aid as we can. So it's been keeping our department pretty busy. Brian's been working diligently with some permitting issues that may be modified on past projects that have been approved in the last 4, 5, 6 years. So we're doing due diligence on those projects. They may or may not come before you because there may be no need to amend them, but we're doing due diligence there. So we're staying pretty busy. We'll continue to be busy, and again, we absolutely appreciate your intuitive nature as planning board meetings, and they do keep us sharp. So we thank you for that.
Thanks, Jamie. Any update on legal issues?
I mean, the answer is, on the state level, with the new statutes, everything's still right in flux. One day, we're optimistic. People are meeting with the Speaker's legal counsel, and hopefully there are changes, and other days, everybody's crazy about where it's going, so
Yeah.
no way to know.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, one of the bills that recently came up in the Senate would make comprehensive permits would be completely out of the hands of communities, and they would be handled by the Department of Housing, which I don't believe they have any planners in that particular department. And, yeah. So that's just the kind of... if there's nothing else, would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
Can I just ask one thing before we adjourn? We had mentioned about compiling a list of points that people would send to their representatives to voice our opinion about some of the suggestions.
You're talking about that individually.
Well, right, and I had said that there's no way I could really compile that list, but if the planning department wanted to give me that list, I could send a letter.
And I owe Jamie some letters, too, that the Planning Association has written specifically for certain bills that he can then distribute for board members to read, which gives you a better
Yeah,
understanding.
we provided a list of some of the legislation that's out there that we received from Rhode Island League of Cities. We can provide that again to you with the statutory references for potential changes. But even that list is evolving. And again, that's just one opinion from one entity. So we can send that out to everyone.
Has the difficult task of trying to support and, 39 cities and towns, so.
Yeah. They're also taking 100 pages of legislation and trying to put it in a nice condensed one-page matrix. So there is some difficulty there, but at least the references to the statutes changes are there.
So there was an attachment at last night's agenda for last night's town council meeting that had a memo from Amy and then like a 2-inch paragraph on each bill. Would that be pretty fresh information?
Yes, we can provide that.
Last night's-
We'll provide that link.
Okay.
Second on the adjournment? Second. Joe, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,